All right, I'm so excited for another edition of Manifestor Mindset. Today is a really special guest. Everyone out there has been reading about the race for a vaccine, and we're seeing all the money being thrown around, all the different companies competing, all the pre-orders and making vaccines simultaneously, which is extraordinary in the history of civilization. But it's also abstract. So we have a special guest today. Klaus Gustafsson. I'm trying not to butcher it. He's Swedish. He said I can call him Bob, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what the Romans do and try to assimilate. But he's on the front lines of being involved and contributing to the race for a vaccine in a very specific way that's really interesting. But I wanted him on for a number of reasons. One, his journey as an entrepreneur touches upon a lot of topics we talk about on Manifestor Mindset, about taking money from investors, when to take money, how to scale, how to stay true to your mission. And it's really fascinating what he's done. And then also a little bit of hope, because if anybody has insight into what's going on right now, what might happen in a year, is Klaus. So rather than, I don't want to give away the entire lead, but maybe we could start by just giving a little bit of an overview of ATUM and how you founded the company 17 years ago.
Yes, quite a while ago. So there are four founders. So I'm one of the four founders, and we all worked together in a company called Maxigen back in the dinosaur era of biotech, so the late 90s, early 2000. And the four of us were like the little core technology development group. So we were responsible for really building up the IP estate around all the different tools for engineering proteins at the time. And the four of us, we saw there was some additional technologies that were really, really interesting that the management at the time weren't really interested in pursuing. We saw that you can really combine, on one hand, gene synthesis. You can actually synthesize DNA straight from organic chemistry and build that into any sequence you want. And on one hand, and the other side came out of machine learning. So how do you search mega-dimensional space? How do you optimize for whatever you want? If you're at the time, late 90s, there were a lot of really cool machine learning technologies driven really by smart people like the Googles and the PayPals of the world on how do you maximize efficiencies and all this. So we thought of how to combine those two entities, and we saw that was clearly not being able to do that within Maxigen. So we jumped ship and set up our own company, the four of us. And that was now back in 2003, now quite a while ago.
So for somebody who doesn't have a PhD like you, but for everyone watching right now, can you sort of explain what it means to create a synthetic protein or enzyme and sort of the role that plays in figuring out, cures for disease, vaccines, and whatnot?
Sure. So the way I see it, there's really two dimensions. One is sort of the manufacturing dimension. How do you physically make something that a gene or a protein that doesn't exist in Mother Nature? And at the end of the day, at the core of it is, of course, it's just like software. But instead of software, you have ones and zeros. In biology, you have A, C, G, and T. So you have 4 units. And then the way you combine these 4 units is really how you build up a gene for an antibody or your eye pigmentation or whatever it is. And the nice thing, of course, with DNA is at the end of the day, it's just organic chemistry. So you can actually buy A's and C's and G's and T's from any chemical company, and then you can use organic chemistry to put them together in certain orders, and then as they become longer, then you can actually put them at some point into bacteria, and then increase the size and the scope of these synthetic pieces of DNA. And now you can make basically anything you can think of. So the limitation really is on you. What do you want to think of as a new gene that has a new property that has some value? And you're not constrained what Mother Nature is requiring, right? So that opens up a whole, and once you have a gene, you can put that gene, because that's not DNA, you can put that into a bacteria, you can put it into a mammalian cell or a human cell, and have that cell produce now a protein that either comes out of your imagination or comes out of some sequence that someone sequenced in Wuhan. And you can make that specific sequence directly in your lab the same afternoon. And that opens up a whole avenue of opportunities that you can go after in many different directions. So I don't know if that answers, if that makes sense.
So you're going in and out of my stream. I don't know if you're going in and out on everybody.
So I'm dropping out. Yeah.
Can you hear me on your side? Yeah, you're dropping out, but I don't know if it's me or if it's everybody else. If somebody comes in on the stream with their questions, let me know if it's choppy on yours or if it's just choppy on mine. But can you hear me well?
I hear you well, yeah.
All right, well, let's continue. Yeah. So, but be clear, prior to the first human genome being sequenced, none of that's necessarily possible, not to the same extent, right?
Right. So a lot of this technology came online really, and so people have been synthesizing genes from the early 70s, but it was a massive, massive endeavor, huge efforts. So really in the late 90s, early 2000s, it really became possible to do it in sort of a high throughput scale. And so that's when you come to the point where you can start manufacturing any gene or any protein. Also, I think at that time, a lot of the machine learning tools that were developed in primarily the IT industry became accessible, and now smart people were using it to optimize your click profile, whatever it is that if you want to buy a car insurance or whatever it is. Machine learning really drives what ads you're going to see on the screen, and so some of that underlying statistics we can now use to build better antibodies or better genes for whatever application.
So prior to, let's take it to the period prior to COVID, you're building your company. Can you talk a little bit about your philosophy on taking in outside capital? How much of that, you attributed some of it from coming from Sweden, which I'm fascinated by IKEA, and that is one of your heroes, right? And is it part cultural, part you've been burned before by taking in some outside capital?
Well, so I think it was really interesting sitting at Maxigen. So at that time, I was just a peon, a staff scientist peon, and we were working within Maxigen and driving that. And Maxigen was really coming from the other side. We were heavily invested by VC, and it was interesting to see just from the inside how much of the presentation was sort of vaporware. And at the end of the day, I think one of the key insights at the time was that if you're VC driven, your customer really is the VC, because you want to, the point of the company, the product of the company is the company. So you want to flip that company. So from that perspective, you don't really care about your patients or customers or your product that's going out, but you care about making the company look as big and strong as possible, so you can flip it to a private equity or whatever it is. And so we were Maxigen. We IPO'd in December of '99. And we did a fantastic IPO. We had a valuation of around $300 million, which at the time was really cool. And an amazing thing, this is December 99, I think in February of 2000, the valuation was in the order of 2-3 billion, right? And still, we were like a few hundred cute kids with pipette mats. We didn't really have a business plan. We didn't really have a technology that worked. We didn't even have an invoicing system, right? But the valuation of the company was in the multiples of billions. And I drank the Kool-Aid like everyone else at the time, and I thought that was really, really cool. But at the same time, Volvo, which for me as a Swede, Volvo is like the archetype of an industry, of a company, right? That's steel in the ground, customers, certain invoicing systems, all these different things, right? And they were bought by Ford for 3-4 billion, right? In the same ballpark as Maxigen at the time, which was just ludicrous. And of course, as we all remember, we went into 2000, and the stock market just crashed and burned, and Maxigen went from being $3 billion worth to again back to a few hundred, and then 40, 50 before, so it eventually sort of dissolved. So that's and at the time there was never a product, there was never a structure. So it was just and at the end of the day, I think that the ones holding the bag were these little old ladies and their pension funds that bought all these very expensive shares right at the IPO pricing. And so when we set up ATUM, we said, let's focus on the customers, let's focus on the products. When the UPS guy comes in at 3:30, 4 p.m., we want to have things that we give to him, and he will put that in the hands of the customers, and they'll give us cash. And that's how you build a real business, a long-term business. And then the other side of that is also it allows us then to really grow it slow and steady over So now 17 years, and we want to do it for easily another couple of decades, because we really want to build this into an entity, right? And the only way to do that without VC, as I'm sure you're very well aware of, is just by building slow and steady, and just ramp it up in an organic fashion. Whereas if you could bring in venture capital, private equity, the whole point is to flip the company. So then you got to maximize a very short time valuation, and you build a hyper on it and then flip it. Certainly in the case of biotech, certainly in the case of high tech, may not be as much so in many other industries. But
that's fascinating. Wait, so I want to unpack this because you said a lot of fascinating things, right? So you have been to the mountaintop, right? I'm going to throw out some equity. Let's say as a founder, you still had 10 to 15% equity. You had a multiple billion dollar valuation, right? So what did you learn about yourself in watching your own net worth kind of crater during that exercise? Unless you all put it in treasury bonds before it went south.
Yeah, so I think step number one, I was not in the management of that company. I was just a peon. I still got quite a few shares.
Okay.
But so on paper, I was basically everyone in the company. The janitors were millionaires, right? So it was just on paper. So it was, but it was just paper money. It comes and it goes, and you think you drink the Kool-Aid. You think that you're the coolest guy since since forever, and but then of course it's just vaporware, and then you say, okay, let's just do this properly and just build it slowly and steady. So I think that it just changes. Also, I think at the end of the day, it's just money, right? It's just I love money as much as the next guy, but I think the really important part is you really do something that you love and just build it accordingly.
How do you how do you deal with your team's dynamic, right? So there, of course, there's always a little bit of a tension of people wanting an exit and wanting to feel like it's real and wanting liquidity. How do you get a bunch of like-minded individuals who are willing to wait 10 to 20 years and build something great before they ever see a dollar of that equity?
I think one of the nice things with being in biotech is that, and being really a science-driven company, is that most of the people who work here really care passionately about making drugs, getting drugs to patients, curing diseases, and that is as a big driver as getting a big exit. At the end of the day, if you get this fantastic big exit, what are you going to do? You're going to play golf. I mean, you'd be poured to tears in days. But if you really want to have something worthwhile in your life, let's do something really fun. And I think engineering biology. I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I think that's one of the coolest things I can think of doing, money or not.
Good for you. I mean, I hope everybody's listening, by the way, right now, because that's the bottom line, right? I mean, the life is short, and so you want to leave behind something you're proud of. It's nice to just do it the old-fashioned way. I'm jumping to the end, and we'll go back. But do you think that COVID will do a little bit of a reset and a return to reason, where we kind of build things the right way? And I mean, it's hard to ask that question when the stock market's so frothy, but let's assume that the collapse is coming in the next couple of months, which I think it is. Do you think we'll get back to reason, where we put a premium on building things of value and quality and taking our time?
No, probably not. Yeah.
Okay, I was just being Pollyannish for a minute. You're probably right. Nothing will change. All right, so let's begin.
It'll always be there, right?
Yeah, we are who we are, which is good though, because that's at least predictable, right? The pattern goes like this. So, all right, fast forward. You're building your company for 17 years. COVID strikes. Can you set the table for how that affected your core business, and then any pivots you made, and then how that was made more possible by being autonomous, right, without having to respond to a bunch of investors?
Right. So I think we're plugging along, and we're doing most of the stuff we're doing, working with people, cancer research. We're doing working with companies in the food industry for a lot of these sort of vegan alternatives. We're doing work with agricultural trades with a lot of corn and all these different things. We're working with protein pharmaceuticals, antibodies, all sorts of different things. And then as a provider, providing them with genes and cell lines and proteins. And then COVID hit, and basically overnight, we ended up having this, see customers just basically closing down shop. They just sent everyone home. With no customers for our genes, no customers for our proteins, no customers for our cell lines. And we kind of freaked out. We had a management meeting trying to sort out, okay, how do we parse down costs and how do we make sure that we don't have to furlough anyone within the next few months, and see how we can pass out the cost structure, and then also try to see, okay, so what opportunities are out there, and I think what really happened very rapidly was we saw both some of the existing customers turn on a dime and really start working on COVID. So you look at all the names you see in the media today on people making vaccines and drugs. So many of our customers who used to do a lot of the cancer research, they switched on a dime and started going into COVID and needed help to really expedite that process, make it as efficient as possible, build all these different drugs. And then we also saw a number of customers that we hadn't really talked to, that were much more sort of in the vaccine space or in the biological space, immunological space. They really invested heavily in going into COVID research and COVID drugs, and they needed to have all this support, and we managed to very rapidly get the foot in the door and support them with the stuff they needed. And so what happened, instead of shutting the company down, we really had to ramp it up. So it turned out, I think April was our best month ever to this day, because we just had to do a very quick flip, and the orders really came, the avalanche come in, and we had to parse through that and make that happen. And it was really a quick turnaround.
So I want to imagine your company in a parallel universe where you have a bunch of private equity firms sitting on your cap table. Tell me what that board meeting might be different in February. Like, I'm trying to understand why the decision you made wasn't an organic decision, where there might have been some friction if you had, conflict on money and different, priorities.
So just go back to sort of the Maxygen, and I don't want to point out Maxygen specifically. I don't think that at the time.
It's your reference point, so that's fine.
Just sort of a point of reference. So what you end up doing is you end up building. So if you're VC driven or investor driven, you want to capture as much value as possible off of your product, right? So you build the infrastructure that we have, making genes, making proteins, but also you start making all these downstream because additional technologies, because you, at the end of the day, want to have a product that you want to bring to market. You want to have a drug to cure cancer or whatever it is. So that means you invest a lot of stuff in a lot of downstream specific applications. So that means that your company focus is not to build this broad infrastructure that we've been doing, but really to be much more deeper, because at the end of the day, you need to have an exit with a nice cure cancer drug. And now you're sitting with basically 80% of your asset in very focused around cancer research or whatever it is that you're doing. And to make that flip, at that point, you're ending up sitting with basically 80% of your employees, 80% of your machinery, and 80% of your technology, which is just basically dead meat, because you're going to flip the whole thing and you're going to go after vaccine development or whatever it is. And to make that cut is if you have a lot of focus off of in that downstream process, which we don't have, because we're a service organization. That means that you really can't really drive that turnaround as quickly. I think that really comes down to, if you're VC driven, if you're private equity driven, your goal is much higher towards making a product that takes off in the marketplace. Whereas as a fee for service engine, you're basically your cost structure and your focus becomes much more pivotable. I don't know if that's a word, but let's make it a word for now.
Could be a word. Yep. Right. Well, also as a service industry, you can be a service sector, which is going to have a lower multiple on exit, because you're not totally focused on the exit, right? You're sort of doing whatever is necessary to make a great company and generate revenue. But if you were VC backed, right, you'd be looking for a recurring revenue stream with some downstream participation, so you could have the big fake hockey stick slide. So
yeah, absolutely. Right. So that changes the whole dynamics of the financial situation.
Right. And then as a question for you as a scientist, CEO, I've seen this fact pattern play out sometimes, right? Where you have a scientist CEO who is fantastic on pursuing a big ambition, but by virtue of them maybe being more academic, less business focused, they've had, opportunities to mitigate or strengths and weaknesses that maybe they didn't mitigate them. How have you sort of evolved as a scientist CEO over the years? And, where have you had to mitigate your strengths and weaknesses? Assuming you have any.
We haven't really. We just keep plugging along in our science-minded focus. I mean, for the longest time, we had a rule in the company: never hire anyone with an MBA, never hire anyone with a law degree. We've kind of broken both those rules now. But
wait, I want to stay with that. These are great. I have a couple of those on my wall, so I have one of them. So, Kelly, can we go by each one? Why not MBA? Why not JD?
So I think in both of those cases, what happens is that you bring in these people, and we've certainly seen that in many of our customers and product history, is that then the focus becomes much more around the stuff that an MBA can control, which is cash flow and all these different things. What we wanted to build here with ATUM was really a core infrastructure. So what we've been building is this basically I kind of see this as more a logistics company. We're trying to build a map of biology. How do you navigate biology to make a better drug or a better food or better whatever it is? And to build those tools, that requires a lot of infrastructure. It requires a lot of investments in software guys and hardware, biology. And if you have a very MBA-driven focus, the time span just won't allow that, because you want to build the revenue much faster, and you want to take shortcuts and get in there, right? And the other side, on the JD side, is what we tend to see. And now I got to say, we have a fantastic lawyer now. So everything I said, I've been disproven. I've been proven wrong.
Exception that proves the rule. Fair.
Yeah. But typically what you have is, if you have a lawyer, their main purpose is to say no. Like that's because that's the safest bet. If you're a lawyer, you never risk anything by saying no. Like, but
best lawyers are brokers for the situation, right? Figure out how to get yes and protect you at the same time, right?
Yeah. And if you have an in-house, they control you. But if you use outside counsel, you control them. Right? So that gives you much more leverage. You say, this is the solution I want. Find the risks with this direction and tell me about it, and then we will going to move in that direction. And it's just, I want to be aware of disasters.
Although just now only knowing you for all of 20 minutes, just looking at what I imagine is your personality profile, you're a pretty direct person who is pretty detail oriented, which means you probably have a pretty good sense of your margin on your product, right? But if you didn't have that orientation, if you weren't the way you are, right, could a science CEO get in trouble without some of those tools? I would imagine, because you're profitable. By the way, everybody at home, he is profitable without an MBA or an MBA, right?
Yeah, and we've been profitable for probably 15 of those 17 years. I mean, the first 2 years we're kind of struggling to get traction, but fairly rapidly we were. I know it's certainly in the first few years we're profitable, but not by any sort of margins. Right. But now over time, we're doing pretty good.
Right. But you must have some hacks as somebody and I understand your bias, which makes a total sense, right? Stay focused on the product, the core product, and don't let somebody else skew your values and make it about the bottom line, or not the bottom line, but the marginal cash flow decisions. But you still have to know your numbers, right? Which I assume it must be in your background going way back, because you're detail oriented, right?
Well, some of my backgrounds when I was a PhD student did some machine learning and really trying to understand how to look at complicated numbers crunching and try to figure out how do you optimize in multi-dimensions. So that sort of comes in handy. But also I think it's going back to the point I was trying to make, and you addressed it earlier. So IKEA is sort of one of my iconic companies, and IKEA is a company that really I'm not an IKEA specialist, but I think they are still to this day never took any external funding, right? And it's just been building it. So, but the timeline to build this massive entity is in the multiples of decades. I don't know, they were probably in business for, they started out in the 50s or something. And they started in this little small town right next to actually small village right next to my grandparents. So I sort of seen that grow step by step, and to the very longest time, it was, if you didn't have the dialect of this local community in southern Sweden, you're never going to be allowed to top management, because they're like all the local guys that were building this whole thing for the longest time.
Right. Well, that's a fairly fascinating topic, because when I talk about this up at HBS, in the course I co-teach, that scale is not a objective question, it's a subjective question. How big do you want your company to be, and how big is it meant to be, right? And and just because it was meant to be or could have been doesn't mean it needs to be, right? Like it's what are you content with? And it's a value choice, right? But what's fascinating about your journey is a lot of people don't realize it is in fact a value choice, right? Like you, by definition of not taking an outside capital, grew at a different rate probably, but at the end of the day, 17 years later, you have a self-sufficient cash flowing business that you could pivot on a dime and help bring the world a vaccine. But a lot of people, entrepreneurs, miss the value choice because they think the game is the ever increasing valuations, and then you create a prison of your own making through these,
and that's because of investors. I mean, I think that brings back to the key point, because typically, and I get invited to these, entrepreneur, startup things every so often. And I always come in as the old grumpy guy who says, don't touch, that's evil. Just stay away from that one. Because once you go in there, basically what you're signing on to is you're saying, in 4 years, I promise to increase the value of this company from X to 10X, and then we're going to flip it. And then your hands are tied. I mean, you're basically, there's nowhere to go. So at that point, the game is over. And here you have these, super smart, kids out of MIT, Stanford. They're very, they can hustle. They're ambitious. These guys, they could start, the hot dog stands, and they'd be, ruling the world, right? But their hands are tied because they think that the goal number one is getting a high valuation on the seed round. At that point, they just get stuck in this, this tangent, and they can't get out of it.
All right. Well, let's talk about hope, right? Since you're on the front line and you have visibility, why can you give us? I guess my first question to you is, AIDS has been around almost 50 years. We don't have a vaccine. The fastest we've ever had a vaccine, I think, is 4.5 years, right? Or I forgot the numbers. But the bottom line is, what we're trying to do now has never been done before. So my first question to you is, will it be successful, and why?
I think so. I think that HIV point is that's a great point, because I think that's something we as a society has been pouring huge amount of resources into getting an HIV vaccine for 25 years or something, and we're still a long way to go, right? I think.
Is there something specific about HIV though that makes it more resistant to cracking the riddle than coronavirus?
I mean, every virus, every system is different. They all have their pros and cons, and some are very easy to. I mean, the one specific thing with HIV is because it goes into the immune cells and blow them up, so that kind of limits the response you can have. But so really, every virus has its pros and cons, and I think that what we see with COVID is it seems to be a target that is amenable for vaccines. So the data I've seen, there was actually a really nice paper, I think, out of Nature just like a week or two ago, where they look at the immune response and see that it really looks like it's a good, solid target for vaccine development. And ours, we're seeing, and also I think that a big change that's happened over the last couple of years, and I think synthetic genes is a big part of that. Really, the speed and the efficiency that you can build these things now is just mind-blowing. Right? So I think Eli Lilly went from, I think, 90 days from when they started the discovery of antibodies from patients who had been exposed to COVID. It took them 90 days to identify the antibody, engineer it and optimize it as a drug, and then get it into clinical trials and put it into humans, right? So that's amazing. 90 days. I mean, you go back a few years, a year would be a fantastic speed.
But wait, it's 90 days by virtue of just amplification of focus, or has there been an innovation that's enabled that to move that quickly? Is it just we're all hands on deck trying to solve this problem?
I think both. So certainly in the case of Eli Lilly, I think they just put a massive amount of research. They basically stopped everything else and said, let's put all hands on deck and get this thing done. And they have, of course, massive amount of resources. That, but also the really nice technology has been coming out lately on both everything from microfluidics, how do you move and isolate single cells very rapidly and do nice characterization on them, to what we do, the gene synthesis. Now you can very quickly, you can synthesize hundreds of different genes specifically exactly to your specification, and purify the corresponding protein and make it look exactly like the final commercial product is going to look like, and then test those for activity. And the speed and the quality of that technology has really ramped up over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years. And that's just a game changer. But also, certainly, in the case of COVID, we're having these big companies who just put all hands on deck and really make sure that they basically take, a department of lawyers and put them over at the FDA in Bethesda to convince the FDA to get it through clinical trials as quickly as possible. Right? So it's just the resources are just on a different scale.
All right, so let's continue to take questions. Everybody out there, Larry Scott Blackman, I see you. How you doing, Larry? Thank you. I'm going to get to that in 1 second, but everybody else keep firing away. This is fascinating. So let's level set. You are probably supplying product, constituent components to multiple entities that are chasing it, right? So I think Moderna is now in phase 3. Others are going to be in phase 3 pretty soon, right? Glaxo, I think. Yeah. So, using your crystal ball, I'm not going to, civilization will not hold you to this, but we all need a little bit of hope. Can you tell us the milestones that we should be looking for publicly when we see Google and the next thing pops up on Apple? So just paint a picture of what we should be looking for and what's the best case scenario about when it might be readily available.
Well, I think that so the place I always go to is there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov that collects all the ongoing clinical trials. And I just looked at this morning actually, and I see it is close to 2,890 ongoing clinical trials specifically for COVID at this very moment, or at least yesterday afternoon.
That includes treatment and that includes vaccination, right? Or is it just
vaccines? Yes, so it includes vaccines, includes therapeutics, includes antibodies, all sorts of different things. But that's of course globally, right? So it could be in your neck of the wood, or it could be in Egypt or whatever, right? But that's the global effort going on, and those are properly, aligned clinical trials that are done. So I think so. There's a lot of stuff going on, and even if only 1% is going to be successful, that's still, we're talking many hits. So just getting number of shots on goals is very high at this point. So we can see that coming to fruition. I think what you should look for is exactly as clinical trials phase 3. That's really the
right. Phase 3 is when the rubber meets the road, right? You're talking, I think, in 30,000, 20, those kinds of numbers where you can hit different demographics. What's the difference in terms of efficacy or viability between 2 doses and 1 dose? I mean, that's a big issue, right? Whether or not people have to come back again a month later.
Right. Yeah, and I think what we'll see, so that's one thing we're going to see now I think there are 6 or 7 vaccines that are currently in clinical trials, and there's probably another 10 or so that are being lined up to go there. And what we'll see is that there's going to be some vaccines so you only need one dose, and maybe it's really good for a certain population that has a certain immunological profile, and then maybe you have another one that works better for old people or whatever it is. Right? So you're going to have it's like everything else. You're going to have a differentiation in the marketplace of vaccines. There's not going to be this one solution that fits all mankind's ill. It just doesn't work that way, right? So you're going to have different things that are good for different reasons in different perspective. Maybe also for manufacturing cost and everything, right?
And it's fair to say that one way or another, we'll have a lot of phase 3 study research by the end of the year, right? So, I mean, in terms of hope that we're trending towards a few candidates, we should know towards next year, right? But then we need adoption, right? I mean, I don't know what the number, I've read north of 60% need to be willing to get vaccinated, right? And that's something that I think we as a country need to start talking about, right? That this is going to happen. I think 2 issues we need to talk about. One, that we all need to get vaccinated when the time comes, because if we don't, then we've gained nothing. We spent billions of dollars and gone nowhere, and 150,000 people have died already. And 2, this is going to be the greatest logistics exercise worldwide since probably the evacuation of Dunkirk. You know what I mean? In terms of, we need all hands on deck. And I'm not sure. I think the government has done a pretty good job mobilizing resources to spur the private sector to chase the vaccine. But I'm not sure I see the same intensity around logistics and education, which I think should be happening now, right? I'm just curious your thoughts.
So I think there's been a lot of investment in building up infrastructure for manufacturing. It's not as sexy and as cool. It doesn't get as much media attention to build a big factory versus doing engineering and making new vaccines.
Right.
But there's a lot of investments going in that direction. And I think the Gates Foundation set up 5 massively large plans or something.
And to be clear, so people understand what we're talking about, supply chain around vaccine and moving, biological materials, very different than sending an Amazon package in UPS through Prime, right? So if you could explain for a second what you need to do to ship a vaccine or any of the products you have. Right,
and that comes back again on shots on goal, right? So we're talking about at this point 5, 7 or so vaccines that are come to the market, that are in phase 3 at this point. But then of course there's all these other ones, and some of them are going to be nucleic acid based. So like the Moderna one is very interesting because it's not a protein, it's a piece of RNA. So in principle, and we'll see how all these things work out, but in principle that should not require -80 or very cold process to get to the customer. So you can probably have that in room temp, knock on wood. Whereas these other ones are more safe bets where you're actually doing classic protein-based vaccines. They will require the whole cold chain for delivery and for processing. And there's just going to be a whole gamut of different opportunities. And it's hard at this point to say which one is going to be the successful one, or the successful ones, plural. And I think that's going to come down to not only efficacy, but as you said, I think you're exactly right. Delivery is going to be a key point. It's like everything else, marketplace. How do you get customers to adopt to your in this case drug, right? Or t-shirt or whatever it is, right? It's how do you get people to get excited about your product, and curing you from that's good leverage in the marketing landscape.
Do you think just knowing what you know, right? You're the most informed person I've spoken to now on this topic. So I just would ask you, are you planning for a world where there is a vaccine next spring? And do you think that vaccine is the principal way we get out of this situation?
Yeah. So I think therapeutics is going to be on the market before. So I think, and to some extent, I think Gilead already had remdesivir, and there's a few other things that are coming on the market. So we will have therapeutics basically starting a month ago, and that will increase. I hope we get the vaccine, best case scenario, end of this year, Q4, or maybe Q1 of 2021. Then I think the big question is going to be how fast can you get it across? How can you build the infrastructure for distribution, for actually inoculating? And I think to some extent, it's going to vary. It's going to depend. I mean, we have a big election coming up, and there's going to be a lot of turmoil in the political space. And I think one thing I've learned is about the future is that it's really, really hard to predict. So because it hasn't happened yet, so it's kind of hard to know.
Yeah. Well, I know you'll be part of it. Is the big question. Let me leave you with this big picture thought. Do you think, from a positive standpoint, a legacy of COVID? Now knowing what we can do when we're all hands on deck to try to attack an issue with a vaccine, right? Attack a virus. I think that's going to change our behavior in the future. I'm just looking back to the AIDS epidemic. Knowing what we did, if it had manifested right now, would we have thrown the resources at it? Could we have made a big difference in people's lives? And going forward, will this now be the way we approach things? That we know, if you think it's a lot of money we're spending on vaccines, but at the same time, if you look at the human impact, it's not, relatively speaking. So I'm just curious, do you think this will change our behavior for the long term?
I certainly hope so. I mean, I think pandemics is something we will have to live. I mean, we've been, HIV is one thing, but, Ebola, and we had the SARS, and we had the MERS, and these things will come up all the time. And I think we've been, to some extent, the last decade or so, we've been fairly lucky, but there'll be more. I mean, that's the way evolution works, right? That's just there's no way around it. Mother Nature's gonna win that one in the end, but we can just fight it as long as possible. But certainly, I think that there needs to be a sort of complete rethink. Not to go all political here, but I think that there has to be some fundamental changes in how we as a nation address these issues and make sure we actually put in the infrastructure, put it in and spend the money up front, because spending $1 today is worth $1,000 5 years down the road, because we really to build that infrastructure on long-term strategy basis instead of doing it ad hoc. Changing it. Every state has their own little system, and they're changing it out every 2 weeks. It's just not sustainable. It's just going to come crashing down, and that's kind of what we've seen here in the United States versus what we compared to me being Swedish, Sweden certainly did not stand out as a force for managing COVID properly, but I think there are plenty of countries done a really fantastic. I think Germany, I know, done a really nice job, and certainly South Korea.
South Korea. I was going to ask you that question actually on Sweden, because now the statistics are coming back around Sweden's way. So just reading your health administrator talking about that the numbers are vindicating Sweden's approach. I can't tell. I mean, it's a pretty high ratio of death to cases, right? But
I think the jury's still out. I mean, I think there'll be a couple of different, there'll be probably 10 different PhD theses on epidemiology, a couple of years from now, where people start looking at, how the different countries react differently and what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah, I think the biggest miss, I don't know how you feel, is that there was a lot of established science around certain elements of this. Specifically mass adoption there's no new studies that told us mass would have efficacy, right? I mean, so that's one, and also aerosolized particulates that transfer, that's been out there in other contexts. So there's a lot of science that probably could have been embraced if we had taken a coordinated approach as a country, as a world, really. I mean, I think hopefully the big takeaway from this is we're all connected now via LinkedIn right here, and we're all doing the same thing at the same time. If ever there was a moment to crowdsource solutions, it would have been now. And we missed the greatest moment to do that, which is sort of tragic, right? We have the United Nations that's came out of war, right? I hope coming out of this pandemic is a UN of sorts. I suppose it's called WHO, but it didn't really work this time. So hopefully a legacy of coming out of this is that next time around we coordinate, right? And I had a really interesting question I wanted to ask you that somebody just popped up. I don't know this question. I don't know if you can read it, but Klaus, do you see self-administratable versions of the vaccines coming?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's coming. We work with a couple of different customers who are developing different versions that you can apply yourself. And there comes in different shapes and forms. And not only for vaccines, but just sort of the delivery across the spectrum. I mean, people have been doing insulin themselves for decades now. So just expanding on that mission.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm a testicular cancer survivor, so I take testosterone injection. I self-administer. I would think it'll be as easy as that little prick, and that's interesting. That's got to help adoption take-up rate pretty significantly, right? If you don't have to trek, because I think telemedicine is probably here to stay. I don't think anybody's going to want to go back to the doctor's office anytime soon, which is a good thing.
Which is great. Absolutely.
For people in rural areas who don't have access to infrastructure, I think that's what I say. When we have a moment and the all clear happens and we could take a step back, there's going to be a lot of great things that do come out of this, as in every crisis, right?
Absolutely.
So the innovation, the lack of travel to startup, telemedicines. There's a lot of great things. Unfortunately, we got to get through this terrible period. But
And I think that's always the case when you have turmoil in the society of any different reason. There are always good things will come out of it, right?
Klaus, here's a very complicated question that only a person with a PhD can answer. What do you think regarding the employment of neural networks in gene sequencing and other genetic tasks, specifically for designing vaccines? I actually don't know what that question means, but you probably do.
I do. We spend a lot of time on that, actually. We have our own little staff here who really focus on. I think I'm not going to go into detail, but I think neural networks is really fantastic. But I think there are probably 15 different types of machine learning algorithms, and they all have their pros and cons. And what we typically do here is when we do all these machine learning, so we certainly do various types of neural networks, but we also do a whole slew of other things. And what we end up doing is large data sets, and we try to optimize for something. We take that entire data set, toss it against this list of 10, 15 different machine learning algorithms, including neural networks, and then we say, let democracy win. Now, if out of these 15, 11 of those solutions provide you with this answer and 2 or 3 provide you with this other answer, we just assume that the majority wins. So I think neural networks is really interesting, but I think there are a whole slew of different algorithms that work in conjunction here. At the end of the day, it's just math, right? It's just 1 + 1 is 2. You can only do it in so many different ways.
I'm going to let you go back to helping save civilization, because we need you. And I'm really glad that you never sold out, because I don't know if I'd be sitting here talking to you and you doing what you're doing. So I appreciate that. I have a feeling you'll be a household name, and although people will still be mispronouncing it in 20 years from now. So just keep doing what you're doing. You're an inspiration, and just keep sharing your knowledge. I think it's incredible, and I'll check back in with you if it's okay, maybe in a few months, and we could see where we're at. around the end of the year.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Matt. I think this interface and this way of I assume this is also some consequence of COVID that you're setting up this.
It is. I just decided I wanted to create a forum. People are alone and nervous, and I like to share information and shine a light, and and you have a lot to share. So yeah,
would you have done this without COVID? Would you have set up?
No, I was too busy. I don't know. No, I wouldn't have. It felt like it's what was necessary at the time. I'm not entirely sure why I'm doing it, but I know it's the right thing to do, so I'm doing it.
Yeah, and it's fun, right? And it gets you excited in the morning, right? That's the whole thing. It's
the people like you are amazing and give a new perspective. All right. We'll check back in a few months.
All right. Thank you very much. It was fun talking to you.
All right. Take care.